My grandfather worked on Sputnik, but after it was already in space.
Yeah, I've known quite a few Russian cosmonauts, and I've been there to the launch site a couple times. Yeah.
You talked about Skylab and all of that. That was, I didn't even know Skylab was a thing until reading your book. Yeah.
Well, you know, you see, that's what I'm saying. It's today's culture and society is so different. Skylab was a hell of a program. I mean, the Russians have been trying to do stuff like that, and there was nothing compared to Skylab. But nobody here makes a fuss out of Skylab.
Yeah, I've never heard about it. And
No.
It was very interesting. And it crashed back onto Earth, too?
Well, everybody knew that from the beginning. I headed up the Skylab branch for a couple of years, but we had no deorbit burns on it. Yeah, slow it down so it comes back in. So there was a little bit of keeping your fingers crossed that when it came back in, that would be in the ocean instead of
that's
on
crazy.
land.
I would be scared if I was living in Australia. Yeah. So, where did it all start? Like, when did you decide you wanted to become an astronaut?
My name is Walter Cunningham, and today I'm 86 years old, and I guess I could be referred to as an ancient astronaut. And can I tell the story about when I decided to try?
Of course. Say whatever you want.
Now that I'm 86 years old, nobody ever remembers or is interested in anything else I did the rest of my life. I was only an astronaut for, I think, 7 or 8 years. But I was a Marine Corps fighter pilot, and when I look back at my own life, that was what was really significant to me. I'm one of those people that started out in Southern California with nothing, always poor, never complaining, and just took it as an opportunity to do some things. And actually, I joined the Navy out of high school. And one of the reasons I joined the Navy out of high school is because they were already starting to draft, not really draft, we had people in our class that were part of the National Guard, and they were calling them up for the war that was going on in Korea. And so some of the friends in our class, they were old enough to be called up. I was still like 17. I didn't join the National Guard, but when I graduated in January of 1950 or 51, when I graduated, I decided that instead of taking a chance at being drafted, I would join the Navy. And not because I loved the Navy, I always wanted to be a fighter pilot. I lived and breathed the airplanes without ever even getting into one. But I joined the Navy to keep from going to Korea and freezing myself to death and getting lost over there. But when I was down in boot camp, I found out that if I could pass a 2-year college test, that I could then go through the physical and end up going to become a Navy pilot. That took me, because I had never been to a dentist or I had never been to a doctor by the time I was 17 years old. They sent me to one. They found out I had 24 cavities. And I had to get those fixed before I could go to flight training. It wasn't too easy to get those cavities fixed, because I could only do it, because I could only afford it, if I was on a Navy base and I was getting moved around while I was learning technology. So it took me a year and a half to get my cavities all fixed, and boom, I'm down in flight training, just like that. And after, probably about 6 or 7 months down there, I found out that the only way you were guaranteed fighter airplanes after that Navy flight training was Marine Corps, because all Marines, that's where the flight training for Marines is also with the Navy. So I immediately changed. I was in the Marine Corps and got my wings. I think I got my wings in December of 52, '53, December of '53. Reported to El Toro. 4 months later, I was in Korea, which that was what I was trying to avoid. So I was in the last squadron that had a mission in Korea. And that was a interesting move, because we had it better than just the ground troops in there at the time. And we were the last squadron with a mission. But while I was there, there was about 4 or 5 of us that had just been, for the first time, they were putting second lieutenants into night fighters, all-weather fighters. So it was a wonderful experience we gained. But after we were there for about, not we, I guess, but after I was there for about 5 or 6 months, they announced that they were having a selection for major. And of course, we were second lieutenants, so we weren't included. But they announced that the following captains are in the zone for major. And then, because they had promoted too many in the past, they said the following majors are in the zone for major. So about 5 or 6 weeks later, when they selected them, it turns out that the lousiest major we had in the squadron, that none of us respected or anything, cancel it out. The lousiest captain that we had in the squadron, that he wouldn't even dress looking decent or anything else, he made major. And the major that we all admired and respected because he was so doggone good in that squadron, he ended up making captain. So the next day was the day I decided that I should go to college. And it took me about a year and a half or 2 years to get back to the right location here, and finally I got transferred into the reserves so I could go to college. And that's what really set off my career, which ended getting me to NASA, becoming an astronaut. I'd listened to that kind of stuff going on, but I knew I didn't have a chance unless I had the college degrees. What else to do? What was the question you asked?
Well, what were you studying?
Oh, what was I studying? Okay. So.
Yeah, what were you studying?
Okay. Well, I'd been, actually the work I was doing in the flying, I was considered one of the more technical guys in our squadrons. So it was engineering, but I became a physics major, and about, must have been 6 years after I had come back and started in college, that that's when I heard the first mission on there. I hadn't decided that I was going to become an astronaut, because that was just a long shot of anybody out there. I was getting a college education so that I would have a better chance at promotions and things like that in the Marine Corps. But on the May 5th, 1961, I was working at the RAND Corporation as my part-time work, which is a science place, and I was working on a doctorate in physics. But on that morning, I was driving from San Fernando Valley over to Santa Monica, and it was a little before 7, and I was driving a little Corvette, tops down, and listening to the radio, and that was a little before 10, down at the Cape Canaveral, and that was the morning of Alan Shepard's first launch into space. Not really a space mission, but today people think of it as, the first space flight, because it went above 60 miles, and it was like 15, 16 minutes down there. And I won't tell the raving that I heard myself going through as we were waiting there. But that was when I decided, maybe not right then, I decided, but in the next couple of days, when I decided that that's what I was going to do. I was going to become an astronaut, if I could. And selection, of course, was very, very complicated at that time. Took months to go through it and all of that. But a year and a half later, I was sharing an office with Alan Shepard, and he was an interesting fellow, a lot different than most of the guys.
Mulholland Drive is still like a very popular. Like I still go on it. We watch meteor showers on it. It's really beautiful.
The what?
Meteor showers.
Oh.
We go to Mulholland Drive and there are cars racing there in the middle of the night and all of that. Yeah, it's a fun time.
Well, you see, back in the 1960s still, Mulholland Drive was, it wasn't loaded with properties and homes and everything, and there was no freeway going from Van Nuys over to Santa Monica, any of that. So it was a fast, at the time, the fastest way you could go over there and do that. Today it's a different world, but I was very fortunate because the first time I applied, I was still there. That summer, I was flying with my reserve squadron, and I was flying a whole lot, and we were stationed down in Yuma, Arizona, and every couple of weeks I would get a call saying, "Hey, you're still in the running. Are you sure you still want to become an astronaut?" What have you? Of course, I always said yes. And when we got to the physicals, and we overlapped. They were like week-long physicals. I didn't know a soul of the other people, not one of them. I was the only Marine there, really. And when we were there all going through the physicals, the guy that I thought was the very best, he and I were sharing a room. And after about 2 days there, I thought, boy, he's a sure thing. I'm going to have to really sweat it out to make it past these people. Because we had when we got down to the physicals, that's when they called us up. And by that time we were down, they'd had 700 people apply initially with the requirements. And there were, let's see, at that time, we had 34 of us had made it to the physicals. And I think out of that, I think 28 of us actually passed everything that they had, because it was more than just the physicals on it. But the best one that was there was a roommate of mine, and I thought he was a sure thing. Instead, he ends up getting grounded, misdiagnosed, and he ends up fighting for 6 months to get his wings back. When he got his wings back, he ends up going overseas. He was the first fighter pilot shot down in the Vietnamese War, and he was a POW for 7.5 years, I think. He's still a great guy. He's back now, and even at his age, which is about like mine. He might be 88 even, and he's still flying a light airplane that he's worked on, built, and out there flying it. So we had some people that were really good, and there were also some that you might question about, wonder now, well, how did he make it? Why him and not this? So there was pluses and minuses, and some winners and some losers. But we were fortunate. Back in those days, the astronaut office and that life was entirely different than it is today. We needed different people to go out and do test flying and starting things off. Today, a lot of us, maybe most of us, might not even get selected because there's such a dependence on science in it now. You don't have to be a pilot. In fact, I think of some of the selection groups, there's more non-pilots than pilots on it. So we were just fortunate to have lived when we did. I think that's what I think about myself anyway.
By the way, you don't have to keep looking at the camera. You just look at me the whole time.
Okay. I'll just go like this.
Thanks.
You don't have to run that.
Did you see Don Isley during the trainings? Did you see that?
Well, when you think about Don Isley and I were selected at the same group. I think it was the second time he'd applied. He was a friend of Tom Stafford's, and Stafford was a very capable, pretty powerful guy that had been selected to the second group. We were up to the third group, and I think that what happened in the second group, they only selected 9 people, and they realized they hadn't selected enough, so we were selected like maybe 9 months later. They had the third group, and they took 14 of us, and I was probably number 14 on that because I was not on active duty. I was considered a civilian, which irritated me a lot. Isley was just one of the people there. Don and I, we didn't really become kind of close friends until we were assigned crew on the second Apollo mission. And over the next year and a half, 3 years actually, we became good friends. And in fact, when Don was gone, when he died finally, I ended up, doing his service and providing for him. But he's been gone a long time. Isley and Wally Schirra and I, we flew that first mission. What people don't realize, especially today, but even then it was, a lot of stuff goes on that's kind of behind the scenes they aren't aware of. When we flew the first mission, most people wouldn't have realized that was the third crew we were assigned. The first one we were assigned, we were working with a contractor out in North America, and we ended up, because it's the first time North American had to deal with NASA and with guys like us that were helping with the design of the spacecraft as opposed to just checking out on it. And there was one delay after another, and so after we'd been on that crew for probably 6 months, they canceled our flight because the schedule had been slipping so much. And we were in a fight, in a wrestling match to beat the Russians to the moon. It's the big key on what went on in our space program back during the 60s. But they canceled our first mission, and about 2 days later they assigned us. We were the backup then on the first mission because we had the same spacecraft. We'd been working together on these things for 6-8 months. But some of the changes were finally getting made in the third spacecraft, some of those that we wanted, because you could take the schedule slip a little bit better. And so next thing you know, Wally, Don, and I are backing up Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. And that was only for about 3 months, something like that. And then Gus, Ed, and Roger, they died in a fire on the pad. And about 10 days later, then we were reassigned to the first mission now. And 21 months later, we ended up flying that. So a lot of stuff goes on the public is not aware of. They're just not interested in a lot of those things like that. Today, it's totally different, the way the whole thing is operated. Some people say it's a hell of an improvement today, but most of us, those of us that are left, we're just glad we lived when we did, because that was what we thought was the wonderful experience on things.
The golden age of space flight.
It was the golden age of space flight. And as time goes on, more and more people are going to realize that.
For when the Apollo 1 tragedy happened, do you remember what your reaction was?
Boy, do I remember what happened when we had the Apollo 1 fire. The problem with the Apollo 1 fire was the hatch, and the hatch on the spacecraft. We had been working with changes which were going to take effect in the third spacecraft to fly, the third command module. And one of the major changes on it mechanically was opening the hatch outward. And with Apollo 1 and Apollo 2, the hatch was a manual one, and to keep it sealed, it was from the inside, it was locked against the command module. And so when they wanted to get out in a hurry, which they ended up doing, they couldn't do it if the pressure was up. So, and we didn't have that hatch closed when we were doing the thing. The power was outside, so it came into the hatch and was plugged in. So the test went pretty good. I mean, there's a lot of development problems still going on, but I mean, that test went pretty good. The next time, the prime crew, which was Gus, Ed, and Roger, they were going to do that same test that we did. And it wasn't the hatch, it was the system and the command module. They were going to do the same test, but they had to seal it off, and they operated on 100% oxygen. And then one problem after another, so a test that took like maybe 12, 14 minutes to do, they were locked up inside the spacecraft for several hours on it. And what happens in 100% oxygen, it all gets absorbed into everything around it can. And we were not designed explicitly just to prevent a fire. In fact, there's a lot of little pieces of material go on the walls and on the screens and what have you, and they were flammable. But it was not even a problem that ever come up. I mean, nobody had even thought about it because they'd flown Mercury program, the Gemini program. They'd all been flown on 100% oxygen. We were all, in those days, fighter pilots, and we frequently would get to a point where after a period of time we were operating 100% oxygen inside the cockpit. So it was the only problem that we remember is Wally, Don, and I, all of us were going to come back to Houston that night from the Cape. And Wally, Don, and I decided that we'd wait. We had some other things we could do, and then we'd wait so we could go back with the prime crew at the same time. So we would end up with 6 airplanes flying back. But when they were having problems, I mean, they couldn't get the test moving along, we finally decided that we would head back ourselves. That was a Friday afternoon. And I think it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we decided, 4:30, we decided that we would say bye-bye, and they'd get home probably the next day. And by the time we landed and pulled into the chocks there at Ellington Field, the vice department head was out there meeting us. So the alarm immediately went up with us that there's something wrong. We had never dreamed it would have been the fire on the pad. But turns out that they had died in that fire, and so we ended up going to work on the investigation board for several months.
Was in Don's memoir, he seemed very emotional about what happened. He talked about saying it was practically murder, and that he was really mad at Shia for not taking more steps to prevent the accident from happening.
Well, Don, at the time, had a reaction, at least visibly, was no different than ours. We all felt bad because we lost friends. We lost prime crew, and we also wondered if they would keep operating the Apollo program on it, because they're losing people. That was the first time we lost anybody in the Apollo program. But Isley at the time didn't come across as any different than any of the rest of us, and that's one of the things that's different today. Back in those days, when everybody was a fighter pilot, and some are maybe a little bit more into it than others, but fighter pilots knew that in their business, you might die tomorrow and never even have thought about it, and you were up flying. I've come close on a number of occasions back in those days, not these days, but we all felt like we had the ability to avoid it, right down to maybe 1/10 of 1% on it. So when the crew died in that fire, our main concern at the time was, would NASA continue to do the operation? And we also, today, people think that that's when we decided to put a different hatch on the spacecraft. Not the case. We'd been working on that for months for the convenience of getting in and out of it. And it was a better hatch we ended up. But now, all of a sudden, where the contractor and even NASA had not allowed us to just run freely on making all kinds of changes. Now that that crew died, and we were trying to fix the spacecraft so another crew wouldn't die in that spacecraft, they became a whole lot more open-minded. And so we made, I think, 1,040 changes in the spacecraft. About maybe a couple dozen of them were significant big ones. The rest of them are things that we'd always wanted to do, maybe in the panels or the displays or what have you, and nobody wanted to pay the money for it, or take the delays that it might cause. So all of a sudden we started fixing the spacecraft. And 21 months later, we launched that spacecraft. I frequently today will think about that. If I'm looking back on it, 21 months, the first fatal loss there in the spacecraft, and all the changes in it, 3 people there, the pressure, the oxygen, and 21 months later, we're off and gone. That might not seem so much to the outsider. But for example, we had the next fatal accident was in the space shuttle. And I personally think that the space shuttle is the greatest flying machine ever built by man to be operated by man. But after that first one, I think that, and everybody in that crew was killed on that particular flight. The recovery, I think it was 31 months later before they got to fly again. Then there was another accident. We had Challenger and Columbia both went on the space shuttle. The next time they had one, it was 36 or 37 months before they got to fly. So looking back to the 1960s, they were critical for our country. They were critical in the space program because so much was being placed on it. The President of the United States had stuck his neck out on, we're going to beat the Russians to the moon. And with all those changes, we did beat it. So things are slowing down, and it's not just NASA's fault about that. It's because the public at large has a different thinking about these things. So that was a bad loss on Apollo 1, but we got a lot of progress out of that made the Apollo program a success. To this day. The Russians have not landed on the moon. In fact, back in those days, they wouldn't even admit that they even had a space program. It must have been at least 10 or 15 years after our Apollo program was over that the Russians began to talk a little bit about their stuff. We knew what was going on, but they didn't even admit it.
So in some ways, Apollo 1 was the first step for Apollo.
Oh yes, Apollo 1 was the first step to start moving us out. It's kind of a little confusing to the public at large because, say, Apollo 1, actually, that was if you were, like we eventually did, if you're naming the launches as Apollo got to launch, just like in the shuttle or any of those, it turns out that would have been Apollo 4, and it was called Apollo 4. But Gus and the crew, but mostly Gus, had been fighting to call it Apollo 1 because it was the first manned Apollo. And that was still just a fight at the time they had the fire and they got killed. But Gus's wife kept pushing the same thing too, so NASA called it the Apollo 1. So Gus was thinking it's Apollo 1 because it was the first manned mission. It was really like 4. And Apollo 7, which was the first manned mission, but that was because they had, after the Gus's mission, we had 5 and 6, and we're starting the Saturn V booster on it. So we were Apollo 7. It wasn't a renumbering system so much; it was just in order.
What was the competition like up to there? Because there's a lot about a pecking order and competition between astronauts. So I know you really wanted to get on a mission as soon as possible and just make sure that you got on, and so did everyone else too.
Well, it turns out that while there's a lot of competition, most of it is it's mental on it, because NASA has its own ideas, and Tom Stafford and damn, I can't remember his name now. In the astronaut office, and the Mercury guys were maintaining their. They had more structure, and they had more impulses that they could follow than us, because they were kings that were made there at the beginning of it, and so we would be fighting amongst ourselves maybe to try to get some of that influence and power, but we had a hard time doing that because it had changed. In fact, when it came to Apollo, that's the first time they'd allowed non-test pilots to fit in there. And before, that was a requirement because everybody had been a fighter pilot anyway. And when that happened, about 40% of our group of 14 were non-test pilots, but we were all damn good. And so it's always a fuss to kind of keep things going like that. And there's always this competition, but we flew with people. The same thing was true if you were in overseas or in combat or what have you. You did whatever you required to keep the squadron working and to win whatever you have to on winning it. But inside of each person, the ones that were good, they all felt like they were really good. And if somebody was there, it's my opinion, in a fighter squadron, and they were concerned about stuff all the time, get them out. Save their lives, and maybe ours.
So when you got onto Apollo 7, what was your feeling like? Because before then, it seemed like after Apollo 1, maybe the public didn't support it or not want to fund it anymore. So once you got Apollo 7, that succeeded.
Well, when we got assigned Apollo 7, it was logical because we were the ones that we by that time we'd had 14 months of experience on the same spacecraft as Gus's crew had. We'd been operating as a flight crew since, I think, December of 65, and all through 66, and then about halfway through 66 is when they canceled our mission. We were back up on the other one. And Gus, Ed, and Roger were scheduled for that first flight, and the test that they were making was on the, I think, 27th of January in 1967. And the scheduled flight, the scheduled launch was 30 days later. We all knew it was not going to go in 30 days. Nobody would admit it. None of the administration would admit it. But we all realized it was not going to go by the end of February. Just too many things that had to get done on it. So it's, but everybody also knew that the guys that were going to fly it, they were all committed to doing whatever is necessary to fly it and to make it a success.
So on Apollo 7, what was the point of the mission?
Well, Apollo 7, we took over the first flight of the Apollo program, first manned flight of the Apollo program. And we added, because we had time, we added maybe a lot more objectives on it, but the object was still the same. Test this spacecraft, see if it can be safe enough to take people out to the moon. We'd not been out to the moon on any of the others on it. And it was a standard, like any new airplane, any new spacecraft or what have you. And it takes, in management, it takes a lot of management kind of commitment to go ahead and do that when they know there's risks involved in it. Like, look now, we're operating out in zero gravity and in space now. Whether you like it or not, that's not as good as being down here on Earth and having a nice atmosphere out here. It's 21% oxygen. It's a different kind of world. But the attitude is what's the most important, in my opinion. You've got to have the attitude that you're going to handle it, you're going to survive, regardless of what happens. Now, I know that's stupid, but we had to have that kind of confidence to do it.
What was it like being in the back of or in Apollo 7, the capsule was like basically the back of a car seat, being 11 days with 2 other guys?
Well,
how was it?
Well, we had a lot of pluses and minuses when you actually got to fly. It's hard to have this fit today, but the guy that worked the least on our crew, Frank Borman and I would, then he was on the next mission, but Frank and I, we would spend the nights out there at the factory lots of times and participate in the tests and stuff. But on our crew, Wally probably was the one least concerned. It was his last mission. He'd been there, he'd flown Mercury, he'd flown Gemini. And even on Gemini, the crews had a lot more authority. They were able to do kind of more what they wanted. By the time we got to Apollo, all the rest of the management in there had decided to start fixing up this case where they're having to do what the pilots are pursuing more so than what they are pursuing. So that's when it started changing back. Today, you really got to be very convincing if you're one of the crew to get something done, because the other people they're working their tail off too. I don't mean to say that what they're doing is nothing, but the whole business of who's in charge and all that, it kind of runs around in the background and affects things. And today, it's coming out different. But back in those days, we could get most things done that we wanted to. We had to have a good reason to do it. For example, on Apollo 1, at that point we still didn't have any little lever, the little metal things that would protect the switches. So we had to work our tail off for a while to get them on every one of those switches on the panel to put it so that if you're in zero gravity and you're floating around and you bump up against that, what are you going to do? You're going to change that switch, and you don't want to have that switches changed. We had like 1,800 or so different switches or things to do in there, and we were able to get those in. I mean, some of these are simple-minded things, but you've got to be able to get them in, and we were very successful in those days. So when we finally got to fly, Don and I were very enthusiastic. Wally was pretty enthusiastic, but they'd had to convince him to stay another year and a half when he was getting ready to leave. They had to convince him to stay another year and a half, and so he was resigned to doing that. But he was trying to do a good mission too. But his standards and his level of management was evolving over time, so things were changing a little bit in there.
Do you think it's better or worse for the pilots to have more control?
I think that when I look back on it, part of that change and getting them to operate under management was probably sensible. But all of it, no. Today, it's out of their hands. The crews, they're riding along at whatever management wants to do with it, and that's a difference. So some of them are really nice people, and some of them are really qualified people. but at the same time, it's a different mental attitude. Some of the people, like maybe me, wouldn't even make it today because they've got a different kind of focus. As time has gone on, I've learned some of those things, but at the time I didn't realize it. I knew I was maybe the best fighter pilot in the group. That's the attitude maybe, but today that wouldn't be what would carry the weight on it. And a lot of our guys in our day, we would probably not make the screening that's going on today with it, because there's a lot of PhDs, a lot of ladies, some men, some military, some non-military, a lot of it. All the kind of social things that go on actually make their way into the space program too.
Yeah, there are a lot more scientists now and a lot more.
Oh yes, and it's because the science is the work you're doing up there. And the kind of sad part for much of us is that at least for the last 7 years or so, the only way we've been going up and back and forth is with the Russian spacecraft. The Russian spacecraft, it's called a manned spacecraft, and occasionally it gets manned, but most of the time in the Russian, the Soyuz, there's just barely enough time when they got the pressure suit on to just fit in there. They don't have anything to do. It's automatic. Re-entry the same way. You get in, spacecraft brings you back. So it doesn't have quite the same appeal to it. And even from the very beginning, a lot of the Russians didn't have the level of flight experience that we did, because we were focusing on that, and they were not. Like, look at what's his name, Yuri Gagarin. How old he was? He was, I think, maybe 24, 25. I think he had maybe, I want to say, a couple hundred hours military stuff, and they've started lowering the requirement on our people now for their military flying experience. Back in when I was there, remember probably the screening area that was the most of a problem was you had to make sure you had enough flight experience. And I can remember Rusty Schweikert. He was selected when I was selected. They were selecting 14 of us, and he was flying in an Air Force Reserve squadron. He retired after that. I maintained my affiliation, but Rusty, for several months as he was going through the selection process, he was flying that in a reserve squadron as much as he could, because he wanted to get to 1,500 hours, because that was the minimum on the requirement. You see, so that was what was driving some of it. Today, it's a different kind of requirement.
You also had a lot of freedom to fly wherever you wanted, pretty much.
Yeah.
Work and all of that.
No, we really weren't supposed to, but we managed to figure out how to get away with it sometimes. Go hunting, or a couple of guys, I think they had a date someplace in the United States, and they would manage to get there. But people today may not realize the value of the time you get flying high-performance aircraft under a variety of circumstances. A lot of people, today they fly only if it's VFR and all that, and you've got automatic flying on it. A couple months ago, I was on an executive jet that was going to Phoenix out of Houston, and the guy that was commanding the airplane I can't remember who owned the airplane, but he was the guy that was in charge of it, and he might even have owned it. But he asked me to come up and sit in the co-pilot seat with him, and yeah, go ahead and fly. I sat there for about an hour and a half before I went back and started doing some other kind of work, because I never touched a thing in an hour and a half. The only thing that he had touched in an hour and a half was on the radio. He talked a couple times. That airplane, after you take off, you left it there. The takeoff climb power, while it was climbing out, it had to change course. Nobody had to do it. It was in the airplane. It's automatic. It's electronic, And that's why the pilots today don't get as much experience as you used to. So it's a different. After an hour and a half, I hadn't had to do one thing. I went back and went to work.
Yeah, I guess they started putting a lot of emphasis into safety, just automizing as much as they can.
Yes, and a lot of things are big pluses when they do that. On the other hand, it takes a lot out of the mind and the capability of the person that's responsible for it. So you've got to really have the right attitude to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember seeing the, was it Chinese or Japanese airplane in San Francisco that was automatic, doing automatic landing, and the commander was standing up there when it landed short?
I don't remember.
Oh, it was terrible. I don't know. I think they lucked out without too many people getting killed on it, but it wiped out the airplane, and the commander hadn't even sat down in the seat because, well, it was automatic landing.
Wow. Yeah. Well, back to Apollo 7. You talked about a lot of controversy on it with Wally and the
Oh,
ground
yeah.
control.
Yeah.
So, what were your thoughts on it while you were up there, and like, how did you deal with it?
It was one thing that is truly unique about Apollo 7 is that we were the first, maybe not the first crew where they had a cold on board, but it was the first one where anybody knew about that anyway. Wally Schirra had a cold, and I never had a cold at all. Isley maybe coughed once or twice the first day, but he never had a cold either. But we were all taking the pills because Wally was in charge. He's an old-fashioned military guy. His father was an admiral. His grandfather was an admiral, and Wally was a captain. And by God, he was going to be like his dad and his granddad out there. So when he got a cold, what the public doesn't know, what's interesting is, how do we end up with a cold in the first place on board? Well, we launched, I think it was a Friday. The preceding weekend, we had already had to stay down at the Cape, and we went bird hunting. And this was October 11th, but it was like October 4th or 5th, I don't remember, but it was the weekend before. And a couple of the ground people there that we worked with all the time, they took us to go bird hunting, it was Wally Don and I. And it was cold weekend and wet weekend, and we were out there, and we found out later that, in fact, we went 2 days before the season had even opened, so we were really in trouble on some of that. But it was cold, wet, heading back. We knew there was some concern about a cold, and I can remember that I went off with a friend. We didn't go to NASA doctors. We went someplace else and got some doctor to give us a cold pills or the shot or whatever the hell it was. But and I think Isley may have done that too. Wally, nah, he didn't. It was typical Wally. He didn't do that. So, and we all seemed to be okay, but until we got in orbit, Wally immediately was coughing and not feeling good, with blowing his nose. In fact, you talk about things going on board, nobody even aware of these kind of things. We had a limited amount of little Kleenex. I don't even know if they called it Kleenex at the time, but what we had, a limited amount of it. And the first disagreement we had was when Isley and I started leaning on Wally, because Wally would take one of those Kleenexes and go and throw it away, and then use another Kleenex. And Don and I started pointing out, we said, hey, you can't do that. We've only got a very little bit left here. We were concerned about making the full 11 days. Wally was not. He never had been in the preceding 2 missions either. He wanted to get most of what he could do and go home, basically what it was. And he was using that. So we had a little minor fight on board about the Kleenexes. we had a little disagreement, but we went along with it when he started taking his pills, and we had a limited amount of meds around the spacecraft. And Wally said, okay, you guys take a pill too, because he was talking to the ground, and he told the ground, we got colds. So the grounds thought that we had colds. And when one of us was talking to the ground, I don't think we had the balls enough to tell them. So, no, we don't have a cold, because it would have been just a conflict, with Wally. And they were having that anyway. Wally knew he was leaving. He didn't care. He was gone, shortly after we get back, because that's what he always planned on doing. And they knew it on the ground too. So things like that come up. But we also have a lot of things that we do together and we enjoyed. He had another fight with the ground about the TV cameras. Well, we got an Emmy for the first live television from space. But they wanted to do that on the first day we were up there, and Wally was already under his couch, and we were up there doing the work, and he was already coming down with a cold. He didn't want to do that. We managed to put it off. I think he was kind of right. There was no reason to kind of move it up. But the next day we started doing the TVs, the live TV. It went pretty good too, as a matter of fact. But there were things that we had some disagreements about, but not much of anything. And I don't remember ever being, on my case, for anything. But we had to be careful when we started having a debate about some of those things, too.
Are there any lingering feelings that maybe he was the reason that you didn't go to space again and Don Isley?
Oh, definitely. Definitely. But I was supposed to fly the orbiting geophysical observatory. That was supposed to be our mission. I was in charge of that program for a couple of years. But then Pete Conrad decided not to leave NASA after 12. He was kind of up in the air about it for 6 or 8 months. So he ended up coming in. He was senior to me. He was very good. I resented the fact that I was moved out of the prime crew when he got there in a second, but I understood it. I didn't have a lot of anger with Pete, because I knew that Pete was excellent, and he ended up having to be too when they on the Skylab. I've often wondered, would I have been able to do all those things too? But today, public at large, they don't hardly even know about Skylab. That's the way it was.
That kind of goes back to pecking order, right? Why Pete Conrad was.
Oh yeah. I think Pete was one of, maybe the best of any of our first 3 groups, 30 of us that were there. Pete was just, and he was not egotistical about it or anything. He was just a good guy. So it's nice working with Pete. I hated to see him go. Actually, by the time we got selected, there were 30 astronauts. There was 7, then 9, and then our 14. And today, I think 10 of them are still alive on that.
Do you still talk to them?
Well, that's the other thing. It's hard for the public to understand is in general, it wasn't like an organization where everybody was just close together and all that. Usually a couple of people. It was like, for us, it was like in a fighter squadron. You had some people you'd like to fly with all the time. You liked them. You were interested in the same things, stuff like that. But the 30 never hung out together. The 16 never hung out together, although there was numbers in them. For example, when it got after we had 30 of us down there, 14 of us were in that last group, and some of those people had gone through that selection process. Not all of them, but some of them had gone through the selection process once before or twice before, and they knew each other. The first time I showed up where they had a meeting on us was after we'd been selected and they were announcing it. That's when I realized I didn't know a soul. I was probably the least contact of anybody there. Some of them had been through the selection process for Mercury and Gemini, who are now in. So it was a nice group, but we didn't operate where everybody's just hanging out together. And in our group, there were 5 of us, I think, that didn't have the real contacts with the existing ones. So we tended to hang out a little bit together. If we were traveling on business, not business, it was all education during those times, but we might like fly up even to New England and let's see, Bill Anders, Rusty Schweikart, myself, Alan Bean, maybe somebody else. But we tended to do a few things together because we felt that we were getting not treated quite as fair as those others. That they'd been squadrons together and they'd known each other and things like that.
So when you got back from Apollo 7 and you landed and you guys had the parades and everybody celebrated you, what was that experience like, feeling like an American hero at that moment?
We never thought about that stuff. I can't speak for everybody else, but I never ever thought about it. Not to mention the fact that we didn't have a parade, and we didn't know that they had wanted to do a parade in San Francisco, but Wally had turned it down. So later we found out some of those kind of things. It was a different world, and I liked it better than today's world. Talk about being different. For example, there was some little fights going over to starting the first live television. But when we did it, we enjoyed that break. Excuse me. They could only do it when we were passing over the U.S. because we had air-to-ground radio contact for about 12 or 15 minutes. It was the only time we had fairly long TV contact also. And so we kind of enjoyed that on it and working together. But when we got back, I'll never forget this. I don't remember, we'd been back a couple weeks, and NASA got an announcement that we had been awarded what do you call it, the award for television, live television. So we'd gotten that award. And I remember Wally and I talked about it, says, well, we can fly out in Hollywood and have a good time. And NASA says, oh, you're not going to go out there, you know. We'll let them ship you the award. I get a box, a crate in there. And so I've got an Emmy that I never paid any attention to, and it sits on the front of my house I live in when they come in. And every once in a while, maybe once or twice a year, somebody will say, what's this? So I just feel fortunate to have had the life I did.
Why do you say that you like the world back in the 60s more than today?
I like the world back in the 60s because, it's principally the change in our society. Back in that period of time, it was universal to try to be the best. I'm sure that's not 100%, but that's kind of the way we thought. And you could accomplish things, and you did it on your own. You didn't have to be fighting for the government to be taking care of you and seeing that you're being treated the same as somebody else who's been treating himself. And if I talk to the young people today, that's one of the things I tell them. Says you're responsible. You should, and also you should be living a life where you're willing to stick your neck out every once in a while. Sometimes it's financially, sometimes it's some other way. But our society has evolved to the point where everybody's supposed to be equal in the outcome, not equal in the opportunity. And so I've always been in favor of that. I don't have any prejudice against anybody until I see how they stand out on things. Some of the best people I know on some of these things are surprised to find out how good they are. But you asked how things have changed? Today they talk about equality of outcome. they don't understand. It's just equality of opportunity. That's what makes it the way it is. I never had a thing in my entire life. I started off when I was 8 years old, working. And I don't remember ever feeling bad about it. Sometimes even the work might pay off a little bit. Sometimes it didn't. But I never looked for someplace else or the government or somebody else to fix it up. I did whatever I had to start to move ahead. And I feel like I have had one of the more fortunate careers, not the most probably, but one of the more fortunate careers that I know.
Oh, sorry. We talked a lot about marriage and how astronauts acted when they went out and they were away from their families and partying in Florida and everything.
Some, most of them.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to give any names.
Yeah, you don't have to, don't out. But it seemed like a lot of that occurred, and I like. What did you think about that when you saw it going on? You were with them, and
Well, I can remember one of the rare times that I participated, and I participated because at the time I got leaned on to go with somebody there. I thought for a second, I thought, this is going to be what makes me with him. And I can remember doing that. But most of the time, everybody just operated on their own. They did what they wanted to. I wouldn't tell everybody all the things I did, but I'll never forget that first one because it in my opinion, it kind of cut me in on the friendly side of a guy that was important to be on, because he was in charge of a lot of things. So you figure out your own way that you want to participate, compete, or what have you. And there was a few astronauts in those days who were very straight arrows. But remember I told you they were all fighter pilots, and it was not that perfect in being a fighter pilot at that attitude.
wasn't Don's after he divorced his wife, or I guess it was before he divorced his wife, when he went to Florida, and his second wife he met there, and she knew a lot of the astronauts, and she knew what they were doing, and she was very disrespected during that time.
Well, only by the wives, because a lot of the guys had dated that lady. Mm-hmm. And she was a nice lady, but we were all kind of shocked that Isley was that wrapped up. And that was before we flew. We had a hard time getting him a day before our launch and 2 days before our launch, and having him there for the things that we were doing. He'd be a little late and all that. We kind of knew what was keeping him late. So you've got to be willing to do whatever you have to do on it. And some of the guys, in my opinion, had a very terrible history of doing things like that. I don't know how good their marriages were at the time, but the wives started hanging out together and sharing the stories and doing things like that, which I think it was tough. But everybody also realized that they couldn't be presenting an image out there that all this was going on. So they looked out for things too. I didn't worry that much about it. I basically was oriented towards my job, and I didn't realize until decades later how much of a handicap I had because they thought of me as a civilian. Being a Marine Corps fighter pilot was the important thing to me. In fact, this month, I'm getting the best award in my mind that I ever got. I'm being inducted into the National Aviation Hall of Fame, and I've gotten a lot of other awards, but this was important to me because I'm getting acknowledged for what my commitment to flying was. It's hard to communicate that, I guess, to some people, because today fewer and fewer people go in the military. That number is way down from what it was. If it was me, I'd have a draft for everybody. I don't know, 18 months or whatever it was. And then they could go on and do whatever they wanted to. And I guarantee you that if we did that, society and the culture would not be the same it is now. And most of those people that put that time in, they're being challenged and expected to do well, and they do enough and they get by. Most of them end up being proud of what's been accomplished and the challenge that they've had for that. Not everybody today, maybe. But, I'm going on record as just saying, if it was me, I'd be having a draft.
Yeah, a lot of people view the military as the killing machines. You know, they're funding them and then they're going to other countries. Sometimes wars that people view are not important.
Well, and those are individuals on it, but I'm not a big fan of all that either. I am a fan of being the best and the most powerful and the best behaving. As a matter of fact, since the Second World War, we haven't been able to list winning in anything. They fight for a while and they tailor it off. You know, look at Korea. They're still considered at odds. So it's a different world, and I'm glad I lived when I did.
Yeah. Well, I hope we don't have a World War III.
I don't either, but if we do, I hope we're willing to do whatever's necessary to be the winner. Yeah, and it is the whole society is getting tougher and tougher. Yeah, didn't have to worry about a lot of these things in the old days. The craziest things that I've ever seen is we've allowed the North Koreans to get to the point where they have nuclear weapons. That it's crazy, but that's the way it is.
A lot's changed since then. How was family life for you while you were gone? You were gone away from your family for a long time. Do you think it was worth it?
Back when I was at NASA?
Yeah.
You know, I think that we occasionally, most of us, had a little bit of thoughts about how that was not really good for the family, all the traveling we did. But in general, we knew that that was part of the job and that we had to do it. And families, they did a hell of a job. They ran everything then. We were gone all the time. They ended up having, kids in school, problems. I can't remember. I think I was in St. Louis one time when I get a phone call from my wife at that time and saying, hey, we need to get a new refrigerator. This one, they came and looked at this, it's not working. And they wanted me to come home, so I go get a refrigerator. And I finally got some number of somebody else for General Electric or something and ended up doing it. But that's not a good family way to handle things, but you had to do it. And the women, the wives, almost all of them, they made so much sacrifice for the careers of their guy there. And that's a different change in our culture today, too. They don't like to think of things as you're giving up for somebody else, to benefit. But a lot of that was necessary. And I think the wives in those days ended up sacrificing more than the guys. There was one year in there, I checked my flight book, I was on the road one year. I was on 275 days, I was someplace else or on my way there or way back or what have you. And at the time, it wasn't a big deal to me. I mean, I thought that's not too good, but I'm just doing it anyway. But think of the wives that have to put up with that, because there's a lot of things that goes on in a family that takes more than just one person to solve.
Yeah. When did you get married to your wife? Did you get married to your wife before you?
I was married. Let's see, how many years before I got there? By the time I got down there, we had both my kids, and the oldest one was 1 year old. No, that was the youngest one, 1 year old at the time. And they grew up there going to school, and with that group there was a lots of astronaut kids going to the same school because they're right close to where we were operating. They take space flying as nothing to them. I mean, because their whole life, there it was on it. So there's no big deal. My kids they turned out to be very, very good, very nice, but there's no big deal out of space for them.
Yeah, when I talked to Don Isley's children,
Yes?
they were just like, I was surprised when I was like, how was it having a father as an astronaut?
Uh-huh.
And they were like, well, it was like they couldn't really answer it because
Right.
it wasn't anything
Right.
special as it was for the public.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, I remember that. Yeah, I did his the statement on him when we buried Isley. It's a shame. I've lost so many friends, I don't even like to think about it.
Yeah, there's a story you talked about. There's a really funny story about Isley when he jumped into water during a party. He into a canal.
Oh yes, God, that was down at the Cape.
What happened during that? Like, how'd that all occur?
Well, I didn't know that he had not. He had decided, and I'm sure it's because he had a couple drinks. He had decided he was going to swim back from that guy's house back over to the hotel where we ought to stay. He had to be a hell of a lot better swimmer than I ever knew him to be if he was going to do that. But he went down around one corner, I think, and came ashore, and they found him asleep there on the water, right next to the water on the thing. But he was basically a fairly clean guy. But in those days, some of them didn't have the kind of mental discipline to, keep with the family on it. It's a shame on it.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about NASA today than it was in the 60s? How's it changed in the politics?
Is any of this interesting to you?
Yeah, I'm loving all of it, yeah. I'm just letting you talk and say whatever you want.
Yeah, I know, but I can't tell by any expression on your face whether you're on the plus side or the negative side of it. NASA has changed considerably over the last 50 years. And that's not unusual, as time goes by. But what we have here is NASA is less of an organization, not in size or anything like that, less motivated than it was back in the days of when I was with NASA. And that's because they've evolved, when things are getting that kind of money from the government, they start adding governmental or political things to it. NASA, for example, today, they've got, they spend some time talking about space, but they spend time talking about various students in different technical areas. It's supporting them a lot, putting part of the budget into that. I work with those kind of organizations, but I don't do it through NASA. They've a lot of spending time on global warming, using that governmental operation on that, which human-caused global warming, incidentally, you may not like it, but it's a total jerk. It's nonsense. Believe me, and I've talked about that too. But NASA spends a fair amount of time on that. Lots of money is going into those kind of areas. NASA is not as efficient as it used to be. And I've noticed even with like the last guy that just got appointed, he's a former Air Force guy, I think. Was he a congressman or a senator? But now that he's there, he's turning NASA into more of a political organization. And NASA got to where it is because it was a political organization. There's like, I think 10, maybe 11 now, NASA facilities around the country. And they have a hard time cutting back. They could cut back to 4 or 5 is where it is now. But it's because back when they were trying to get the money for the budget, they would get support from maybe some people in Northern California by having a facility out there, someplace up in, in Ohio, places. So they end up with organizations that they found something that they could do, but they were organized and open, so you get political, financial support from those. And that's not very good, but it's part of our system. And it's not just NASA, it's what's happened to the system.
Sorry, our audio cut off for a second over here.
Into Mars and out, but when they get to that, it'll be very much like when we went to the moon. The technology that we developed to go to the moon and back, we still are seeing that, and it was a revolution in the technology that we've taken. And the reason we were able to do that is because we had the guts to start with almost nothing. Yeah, it's amazing to me. And I think that we're going to see the fallout of that, the plus parts of the fallout of that for another 10, 20, 30 years. I think it's going to be a while before somebody goes to Mars. But if they do go to Mars, they're not going to go to stay there. They're going to go to land and come back, and it's just a symbol. And the things that we do today, they depend on what we developed to go to the moon, years ago, almost 50 years ago now on it. You wouldn't even imagine the computer we had on Apollo. The computer we had on Apollo, and it was the one that was kind of got us started in developing this and getting more and more. But on Apollo, we had a computer that was about maybe 15 or 18 inches cubed. It weighed about 40 pounds. And we had 40 kilobytes of memory, kilobytes. And I think we could only access 8 or 9 of those kilobytes. The rest was built in there to it. So you had to be very careful what you picked. We used the octal system on our programming because it could be a little more efficient than that. And look what we're getting now. It's unbelievable. So that kind of stuff is there to be gained, but it has to be at a point when you really need to move to a new frontier. And I look at Mars as the next frontier myself. Not to mention the fact that with all the technology we've developed over the last 30, 40 years, the unmanned technology on Mars is amazingly good. They've done a job 1,000 times better than we ever had unmanned to the moon before we went there. So there's not a real need to do that.
Yeah, it's crazy. Like you had such little memory going up into orbit or to the moon, and now in my opinion, I think we should have already been to Mars with all the technology we've created and all the memory we have now we could store in computers and all of that?
I don't see a plus to come out of being there. I see it only as just a technical boundary that helps you develop technology on it. And we had none of that stuff. For example, like right now, they've got essentially 100% air-to-ground communications. And that can be a real pain when you got a lot of other things to do. Would you have any idea how much time we had air-to-ground communications on Apollo?
Is it every 30 minutes or every 90 or something?
Well, we didn't have the kind of communications we have now, so it wasn't with a satellite. And we had a couple of ships in some of the water parts. The only place where we really had prolonged communications was across the U.S. because it took a while to cross the U.S. But the whole thing has changed because we didn't have to deal with that. We had air-to-ground communications on our spacecraft 4% of the time.
Wow.
And sometimes that intruded on us, too, because we had other things we were doing. But that's because we had a different mentality, and we were there to do that stuff, not just to let the ground do the stuff and us move the switches and stuff. You see what I'm getting at? So
what's the point of it all? Why should we care about spaceflight?
well, I personally think that the technology we develop is what? Look at the technology we developed about air-to-ground communications on that. Or if you talk about taking pictures and stuff. Now they take pictures all time, anytime, 24 hours a day from orbit, whatever it can be passing over, okay? We didn't have fuel to allow us to maintain an attitude. So we're drifting all the time. We had five windows, about 150 degrees, pretty much in the same plane on it. And we're drifting. So occasionally, there might be pointing at the ground. We looked at the ground, hour and a half to orbit the Earth, 45 minutes of us in the dark. So it had to be daylight to get a decent picture, because we had a camera, not a digital. And if you're looking down, I remember at the time, 55% of the Earth's surface is covered with clouds. So you had to be able to see something down there too. And the camera department on the ground, they didn't want you to take a picture too close to night or day, but we ignored that pretty much. If we could see it, we'd take a picture down there. And we got some good pictures that we took on Apollo 7. But the reason they're good now is because we took the pictures of there, they've digitized it, cleaned them up, they look a whole lot better than they were.
I saw some of the hurricanes. We
Yeah.
see the white clouds swirling around. It was
Yeah.
really beautiful.
Yeah. That's not to mention the fact on Apollo 7, I think also Apollo 8, on Apollo 7, we had 2 3/4-inch thick pieces of quartz glass in each window. And they were separated by a tiny little fraction. And that was so if we ended up getting hit by a meteorite or something and breaking a window for whatever it was, we had another window there. So 2 3/4-inch thick. And whatever they were sealed with at the time, it began outgassing. So by the time it was the second day in orbit, we're already getting little dots and fluids in the middle of the best window, 10-inch round window. I ended up taking most of the pictures on Apollo 7 because where I was sitting, I had the last window that got that. It was like day 10 or 9 or so when I started getting that, because some of the best windows started after day 2 or 3. Okay, so as I was in this seat and my window was still open, frequently they'd send me the camera so I could take a picture on it. But taking pictures in space in those days was different than it is today.
Yeah, today we have very high quality pictures, and especially with the telescope.
Unbelievable.
Yes, it's ridiculous what we can see now.
Yes. And I bet we see a lot of things that nobody even lets us know we can see.
Aliens? Just kidding.
No. I have to tell you, today it's amazing. There are people that believe those aliens.
Yeah,
I know. I've never seen one. Then let me ask this. We got 1, 2, 3, 4. How many of you think that we're controlling the temperature of the Earth with the CO2 that we create?
I do.
Okay.
With pollution.
You? You too? 3 out of 4? You don't. Right. You're right. Well, I have to tell you, it's because I guarantee you you've never looked into what they're trying to say on it. I in fact, am willing to stick my neck out and make some speeches on that. But do you know how much, what's the CO2 supposed to be right now in our atmosphere?
I don't know the exact number. But
400 parts per million?
Okay. How much is it?
Isn't that 400 parts per million, the one they're complaining about?
I'm not sure.
It is, my God. Yeah, see, this is the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah.
You don't know what it's claimed on, but you believe the people that are saying it. Okay? So let's take a look at the 400 parts per million. I'll bet right now, where we're sitting here right now, we've got 600 or 700 parts per million. But we had an alarm. We had to scrub the CO2 out on Apollo. And we changed the filters because we had 100% oxygen and we were exhaling CO2. And we had the alarm. We usually just kind of regularly would change the filters on, but we didn't one time, and the alarm went off. What do you think our alarm was set at?
400.
Oh no.
I have no idea.
3,000 parts per million. Okay. Do you mind if I do this lecture with you?
If you want, go for it, yeah.
Because I'll hold out a little hope that you'll help with somebody else. With 3,000 parts per million. And it did go off once, because we had been doing something else, I guess, and we missed it, so we had to change it. What do you think it was on the space shuttle?
Also, I have no idea.
Well, it started out higher than this, but they ended up with flying the shuttles with 5,000 parts per million CO2. Let's see what other one that they use. Well, right now on the space station, I think it's 7,000 parts per million, but I think they're also trying to change the alarm down to 5,000 parts per million. We've got submarine-launched ballistic missiles, nuclear subs, and you know that?
Mm-hmm.
They stay submerged for over 4 months. They have 100% oxygen, and they exhale, of course, CO2. What do you think their alarm is?
Also really high.
8,000. 8,000. All I'm just saying is, when you start getting realistic about it, which people don't do today, you start challenging. Well, how in the hell do they think that we're doing so and so, with the 400 parts per million? It's just the way it goes. And how much CO2 do you think there is in the atmosphere?
I'm not sure. I used to know. I don't remember.
Well,
It's been a while
I'm
since
worse
I
than that. There's a lot of things I used to know I don't know anymore. But on that, I think that's very interesting, because most of the CO2 that's out there, a volcanic eruption or something, we don't do that. We're not responsible for most of the CO2. But we can take a look and see how much there is there and how much we're responsible for. And then I'll go back to any stupid question you got about.
Well, what are your thoughts about the Great Barrier Reef? Because I've been hearing a lot about
I tell you about that. I took some good pictures of that big Great Barrier Reef. It was already getting bad then. But I'm going to give you this, because just so I can get a little bit of a message in here. The atmosphere out here is 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen. That leaves 1%. And they call that, whatever the hell they call it. I have to figure that out. But that 1% is made up of a number of gases, but mostly 4 different gases. Of that 1%, 3.6% of the 1% is CO2. Okay? Now, of that 3.6%, which is CO2, humans are responsible for about 3.14% or someplace down that, of that. So humans are responsible for 0.001% of the atmosphere. Okay? And we are controlling the temperature of the atmosphere with that. Right? Mm-hmm. Okay.
I'm sure you get a lot of controversy for it.
I have to tell you, I've been kind of following this for a number of years. In fact, I was on the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. I was on the board there for 5 years. I have yet to see one argument made about it that's got some substance. As a physicist, you look at the evidence a lot. So, but you might wonder, one of these days when you see that, you might wonder about the idiot you had sitting down here who was trying to tell you how wrong it was. Okay, go ahead.
Well, going back, what were your favorite parts about your time in NASA? Favorite memories that occurred during that time?
Favorite parts of my time at NASA? Well, I loved the overall experience. I loved the great amount of flight time we got and the various variety of different airplanes I got to fly. I think my main contribution to NASA was when I was in charge of the Skylab branch of the Astronaut office for a couple of years. We got it online and fixed it, oriented it toward the things we'd taken out of Apollo. It was when I first started getting the idea that NASA saw me as a scientist more than a pilot. I didn't like that. But that was, I think, my major contribution to it, was that the thinking and influence I had on that. In retrospect, during Apollo 7, we were busy all the time. And now people know that we were doing well enough on it. It was an amazing first flight, believe me. But we were doing so well that they added 4 more objectives during the mission. And we did 2 of them I don't think we got done. So we ended up, they said we were 101% successful. And so and I use this, I think I told you earlier, it's the longest, the most ambitious, the most successful first test flight of any new flying machine ever. And that's just a factor about it. You know, you don't spend your time going around thinking about that, but it's that.
When you were up there, were you like when you looked out into space, were you thinking like, wow, I can't believe I'm up here and
No.
they got this far?
No.
Why not?
I don't know anybody that had that attitude at the time. We were a different type, good, bad, or whatever the hell you think about it. But when somebody else was doing it last year or the year before that, your orientation was just to do as good or a better job on your mission as he did on his mission. And there may have been somebody, I've never heard one say so, but there may have been somebody that felt like that on the mission. But I don't remember any gee whiz or anything at all about it. I think of the 11 days we had on Apollo 7, we did 8 burns and a variety of things you're moving around and doing for the first time. And I think out of that, the 11 days, 11 days, out of that, there may have been a total of 4 minutes when you were anxious or you held your breath because something had to happen here, on a separation or a burn or a reentry. And we had a very interesting reentry because it was solid clouds, and we couldn't see the chutes. And the only way we knew that we'd open them was when we got down to, I think we got into the clouds for some reason, way up around 40,000 feet or even higher. Maybe we'd had the drogue chutes had come out. We couldn't see any chutes. We got down below 20,000, couldn't see any chutes, but we do remember we relaxed a little bit because the rate of descent we could tell was a little bit more. And when we went through 11,000 feet, that's when the main chutes opened. Couldn't see them, but our rate of descent was slower, so we figured we're doing okay. And we wished we could see the chutes to see if you got some holes or anything like that in. So as we were reentering, we would occasionally look up there. Couldn't even see the chutes, any of the chutes, until we broke out of about 350 feet, 400 feet. We finally broke out of the clouds, and we could say, we got all chutes. We had 3 chutes. So I do remember us being a little concerned about that.
Still better than Russia and their rockets. You said that their rockets would go off last second as they were coming down.
That seems to work pretty much with, I think there's only been one time they ever had a fail in that, so it's like work, but it's not a very convenient kind of failure. They got such a small spacecraft that you don't have any room to move around. And you wait for the last, it's a couple of seconds. I mean, I think it goes off only, is it 15 or 20 feet in the air? I mean, so you got a big bang to come down. And it works.
It's scary.
It works. I tell you, the Russians have been consistent as hell since back, 30, 40 years ago. They've been operating on the same kind of system. Yeah.
Well, in your book, you talked a lot about race and how race plays and sexualdy and gender, how that plays in.
What race plays?
In NASA. So in NASA, you talked about how nowadays the recent submission, they care a lot about bringing in.
Well, not just race. It's mixing up and representatives. And when they start bringing in teachers and stuff like that, and a couple of politicians, the senator from Florida, he hardly ever showed up about anything. He didn't do anything. He was there, but he's proud of the fact he made that. Not a bad guy, but he doesn't understand a damn thing about it either. But NASA over the years has politicized a lot of things like that, and their selection process, and race is just one of them, and ladies, men, and a couple of the lady pilots they got are very good pilots, but most of the ladies in the aviation and the military are not all that good. But that's a bad thing to say these days, because you're supposed to believe that everybody is capable. There's a lot of things that I can't do much today, but I'll bet you I'm better than you in a lot of things. Now that may be stupid of me, but I'm willing to confess that I think that.
Yeah.
So you can shoot me.
I agree. Well, it's already. I don't know. You said you have something to do at 12. I can keep going on.
No. I'm ready to go whenever we can wrap this up. I hope I've said something helpful. I don't know.
Yeah. No. Yeah. We've gone through everything now. It's just talking about tail slate just for good measure. Are you good? Do this one again. This one is good. All right. Lower. Go. Right there.